Hello, and welcome to the DOS Champions podcast. It is the 12th of March, 2022, and today we're going to be talking about sudden cardiac death in football. It's a pretty serious and sobering subject, to be honest, and definitely one to be, to be taken seriously. Alex, after that introduction, how are you doing today?
Dude, I'm doing really well. The baby's starting to sleep for 6-hour spans, which is allowing my wife and I to get sleep. Trying some new dieting and, feeling good. I'm happy that we're heading into summer. And yeah, dude, I'm good. How are you doing?
Doing good. Heading into summer, you say. Yeah,
It's fucking freezing up here.
I was going to say the 18-degree weather up here would beg to differ. The lake is still frozen as well. But yeah, it is nice. Daylight savings tonight? So what do we lose an hour or gain an hour? I don't know. It's a weird shift either way, but that is a sign of thawing and things are changing. Spring is on the horizon. But yeah, I mean, we should get into this, right? Quite a bit of research went into this, especially on your end, Alex. So yeah, I'll just start from the top here. What we are talking about is sudden cardiac death in football. It's kind of been a hot button topic in a lot of ways. We'll get into some of the specifics of that a little bit more. The reason that we did this is, I guess, Alex, is it fair to say, kind of by request? Something that one of our longtime listeners was saying, hey, this is probably something you guys should look into. Not a lot of people are talking about it.
That's right. Yeah. It's a subject I think we're also just you and I, in terms of what we like to cover. These are things that we like to talk about. We do like kind of talking about the dirty laundry in a lot of ways that people won't discuss. So when we saw that the people who enjoy our podcast asked us to do it, we thought it was a really great subject to cover.
Yeah, it really is, and it's a difficult one to cover because there's so much additional baggage, really what you would hope would be unwarranted baggage around it. But yeah, I guess we're kind of going to go at this as almost like a story of how things went during preparing for talking about this, at least to begin with. So the research took, what has it been, like 3 or 4 months that we, and primarily you, have been looking into this?
Yeah, it took a really long time to gather the information. It took a long time because it was difficult, and it was difficult for a few reasons. There wasn't a single source where all this information could be found, and that was pretty alarming to start off with. You would think that you could just look up sudden cardiac death in football and understand what was happening. And by the way, for our listeners, we are going to make all this information public so that you can assess it and determine whether or not it's legitimate and view it for yourself. But there wasn't a single spot for all this information. Truthfully, the best resource I could find to see what had happened over the last year was Wikipedia. And that's not it's not a fun thing to say because it's a serious subject, and coming forward and being like, oh, Wikipedia was the best source is pretty not convincing. But there were many reports, and if not all of them, had false information that didn't help us get to the end game. I should note that all of this stuff, and the way that we determine that sudden cardiac death is up year over year, is there is a FIFA sudden death registry. It is it's a 5-year study from 2014 until 2018. We'll talk more about it later. It's procured by the British Journal of Sports Medicine. It's a peer-reviewed academic study. But everything that we found had to follow the criteria of that study. And most of the information didn't. There were some reports out there that claimed a 500% increase in sudden cardiac death, but they didn't follow the registry's taxonomy. So they were therefore false and really out there to balloon the amount of sudden cardiac death that's happening in the world. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there were reports FIFA had commissioned out to Thomson Reuters, and the statements were simply these claims from FIFA that there was no year-over-year increase in sudden cardiac death, but there was no data tied to those claims. And so on both ends of the spectrum, The people who were confirming an increase and the people who were denying an increase, there was, I guess you would say, hyperbolic information. And finding what was healthy and what wasn't was very difficult.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not really that surprising to hear that type of stuff where, uh, parties with different agendas tend to do things, you know, prop up their side of it. It's one of the things that for me, I kept coming back to through this process is that it really like you touched on, hard to find the information, conflicting information, people not really doing things in a consistent manner. Um, all these things are, I guess, kind of unfortunately par for course with this type of stuff. But there's a large part of me that just wishes that they weren't, and that these type of subjects could be understood and researched in a much easier manner. Um, and
I
that
think
kind of
that's a really good point. I just want to point that out. I think that's a really good take. Along the way, both of us were left wishing that people were having apples to apples comparisons. Either, publications were comparing apples to apples and piggybacking off of each other's ideas, or there was something consistent in the fact finding or the figures that were being put forward. And throughout the 3 to 4 months that we did this study, there were many conversations that you and I had about, do we even want to do this? And I think one of the big factors that led us to the point where we were like, yeah, we do want to talk about this hot button subject, was that there was such a range of information that it felt like the right thing to do, to say, hey, there's all sorts of crazy information out there. This was the best we could do to organize it into a consistent narrative.
yeah, and that's really important that at least we gave it a try and tried to be like, hey, this is what we're seeing by the research that like us as just basically a couple of guys are able to do, and if you really do want to understand something, I guess you kind of have to look into it yourself. But I yearn for some more like, um, you know objectivity in these areas, and like really better and more open information collection and analysis. I mean, the this information, when you went through the process of validating it, I guess, can you kind of like walk us through what some of the key things were, and maybe some of the things that you found along the way that were particularly interesting?
Yeah, of course. So, as I came across sources to help me find which players had suffered sudden cardiac death over the last year, I think there were 10 or 11 sources that I leveraged that provided information. I had to make sure that the dates were correct. I had to translate many articles because most, if not uh, most, then at least half of the articles I found were in a different language. Many were in German and many were in Portuguese. I had to determine the specific reason for death to make sure it was actually sudden cardiac death in the way that the report, the FIFA sudden death registry had established, which is basically a death on the field. And I had to like look at the league credentials to determine that the league that the sudden cardiac death had occurred in was actually a professional league. And yeah, so go ahead and ask
Well,
questions if
yeah,
you got them.
I wanted to interject right there because this is one of the things that I found kind of interesting, and a potential like area for additional scrutiny, and where there's probably a lot of information that's getting missed, and it's very difficult to assess. So because the FIFA study dealt with exclusively professional, some of the findings that you had needed to be eliminated just simply due to them not being in professional leagues, right?
Yeah, so
So
the FIFA study wasn't necessarily just professional players, but part of the way that they organized their taxonomy broke it into professional players, and the professional players were the easiest to find.
okay,
Um, yeah,
no, and it's interesting because it makes it difficult to compare apples to apples, of course, but also there's a whole segment, and really, of a segment of the greater segment of the population that's participating in sport that deals with all the same physical ailments as the professionals would, maybe not
yep,
to the same degree and everything, but really they're like an under assessed portion of it. And the professional game might give us an insight into some of it, but in order to like have a general overall understanding, it's actually fairly difficult
Yeah,
to
no, I agree,
really
man.
see.
Yeah, so the way that the FIFA sudden death registry works is it's a self-reporting line, and obviously I don't know if it's obvious. I think it's true that professional leagues, out of like compliance rules, when this type of thing happens, the leagues and the teams likely have to report it to FIFA. But these incidents that are happening at the amateur, at the elite, or at the recreational level, specifically the recreational level, unless they're reported, maybe even by the individual's family to the FIFA sudden death registry, they don't get accumulated in the data set. Um, so that was a factor.
Yeah, no, and it's something we can't speak to exactly in like great detail, but it is something to point out in terms of these are some of the snags that you run into when you try to assess this type of stuff, and really once again it points to what I hope for is just a more like broad, objective, open discussion and research regarding this type of stuff. Not just on the professional level, but on the amateur and youth levels as well.
Yeah, I think that's going to be one of the outcomes that we talk about. We'll dive into some of the outcomes that we need to
Yeah,
see out of this. I'm just going to cite a few different things that happened during the research segment. So, like, there were many sources that cited a year-over-year increase in sudden cardiac death, but the range of examples that they observed were in a 3-year period. So again, that was an example of a source ballooning the statistics of sudden cardiac death. We found some other sources, for example, that would take like the second division of the Egyptian League and cited as a source for an increase in sudden cardiac death, but it's really only the first division that's considered professional in Egypt. So like the second division is fruit from the forbidden tree, whereas in Germany, like the third division is the cutoff of professional football, and in England, the fifth division is the cutoff for football. So they all have like these different cutoff points for what constitutes a professional league and what doesn't. Um, we also found like evidence of players who had been transferred from professional clubs to non-professional clubs in the year that sudden cardiac death occurred. There's a guy who's a great example of this, Lucas Swerik. He was transferred for €84,000 from a Danish pro team to a fourth division German team. And as I just said, the third division is the cutoff for a professional team in Germany. So even though he was a professional in the year that he suffered sudden cardiac death on the field, at the time he suffered it, he was not a professional player. So he was redacted from our list, but he was included in other lists. And we found many players who had died from like head trauma or cardiac arrest off the field that were included in other studies. So I guess what I'm just trying to get across is we had to really abide by the FIFA sudden death registry taxonomy, and we had to look at every example and nitpick the league that they played in, the way that they died, a whole bunch of different factors, the time that the event occurred in, at what date it was in, to make sure it fell into the range. There were a whole bunch of factors that we had to go through to disconfirm what we had come up with. And I think we ended up disconfirming about 75% of the player cases that we came across and only kept 25% of them, that is.
yeah. And I guess now is probably as good a time as any to maybe get into more the nitty gritty of what the research ended up showing. So we used as Alex has said a couple of times here, the FIFA sudden death registry as a baseline. It's a 5-year period from 2014 to 2018. Once again, procured from the British Journal of Sports Medicine, which is a peer-reviewed academic study. That baseline evidence is 617 deaths over 5 years. 5% are professional players. So that's 30 players over 5 years, or 6 professional players per year. And then what we found, and after all of the whittling down that Alex just discussed there, and trying to adhere to them being professional players in the same way as they were categorized in the portion of the FIFA study that yielded the 6 players per year, 22 players suffered sudden cardiac death, and that's, from what we can tell, a 260% increase, at least from the non-scientific, basically anecdotal research that we conducted. But it's a lot less than that 500% that you would find cited somewhere. But it certainly seems as if there is an increase going on, and we obviously can't speak to like causation, about that at all. But there's another thing going on that is somewhat interesting, and that is the average age was 26 in that FIFA study, but the average age of, at least the evidence that we collected, is 24. So a little bit of a downshift there. Though once again, impossible to attribute any causation. Uh, just some. So those are, that's kind of where we are. What we have found. Alex, do you have anything to add? Anything to kind of clean up from what I said, or
No, that
enhance?
was
Or
perfect. No, that was perfectly said. I appreciate it, Ryan. That was great. Um, that was the pulp. That's what we found. Um, and I guess, like, to recap, we found a 260% increase in sudden cardiac death year over year. What that means, I guess we'll leave that up to our viewers. We can have discussions after this podcast, but I think we should just leave everyone with that data point, which is, again, something that we're going to put on our website. People can look at the data, contest it, and maybe some good conversation can come out after there's been a grace period to look at what's there.
yeah, I think one of the really sad things around this for me is it's this is it's such a politically charged subject, and it's a difficult thing to be able to even discuss openly. Uh, I think a lot of it just has to do with that. It sudden cardiac death. It's a serious issue, and it holds like this unwarranted divisiveness in soccer circles. I think a lot of it has to do with stigma surrounding COVID and vaccine discussion. Uh, and I wish that we wouldn't, prevent ourselves from the pursuit of understanding because of uncomfortable subjects, or wanting to maintain, a really entrenched point of view one way or another. Uh, it's just, it's unfortunate. We need to, if people really are suffering this more often than before, perhaps there's a reason, and it's something that should at the least be looked into further, by people that really know how to look into it, how to try to identify underlying causes, and collect information. And in my mind, this type of thing should be done in a very open and objective way, without any you know predetermined destination in mind, in terms of what you want the conclusions to be, or any of those type of influencing factors. Maybe it's an idealistic state that I'm yearning for, that truly doesn't exist in the real world. But yeah,
No,
that's where.
I think what you're saying is fair. There's a lot of, as you said, there's a lot of stigmatizing of this subject. COVID is it's a very politically charged subject, and it's one that I think a lot of really good writers who probably have a lot of good information, especially those in the footballing world, are apprehensive to cover, because being labeled incorrectly is a byproduct of covering this, or even saying it the wrong way, can really hurt somebody's brand. And there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of information about the swelling of the heart, about um, whether or not vaccines are the right things for athletes, and whether players should have to get them or shouldn't have to get them. And I'm not saying that those things are anything that we're interested in discussing, but I do think that we should be approaching the conversation in a way that doesn't demonize people for having opinions and talking about it. And the more that we can talk about it, really, like, this is kind of like the aim. Like, the more you can protect players, and I just, if that 200 and 60% increase that we found is happening like we think it is at the professional level, what does that mean for like kids who are going out and playing? If we're not talking about this type of stuff, are kids out there having heart attacks without defibrillators present on the field or without proper medical devices? Many of these players who died, sudden cardiac death just means death on the field, but many of them were what's called reanimated or resuscitated. So they died for a moment, like Christian Eriksen was declared dead, and he's one of the guys in the study. But by having the right medical devices on the field, they were able to bring him back to life. If we're unable to have these discussions, there's no way that youth systems or youth programs are going to find it necessary to bring these medical devices onto the field. And so it's really, for the protection of our players, we have to be mature enough to have these conversations.
Yeah, that's really a good way to put it, and it ties together a lot of the stuff that we were talking about, because we don't know that the number that we found is correct, but if it's approaching anywhere that large of a shift, there certainly should be more done, and especially with the indication that the age may be dropping. Uh, that also speaks to what you were talking about with like our youth clubs going to take the time or money, resources, all that to invest in the proper training and devices necessary to combat this type of thing. Well, if they don't have any information from reliable sources to indicate that that's what they should be doing, they're far less likely to take the appropriate steps. And the truth can set you free, I suppose. Not that we have the truth at all. It's really hey, this stuff's really difficult to talk about and research, and maybe it shouldn't be, so that like people get the information they need to take appropriate action. Even if that appropriate action ends up being outside of, or especially if that appropriate action ends up being outside of what your like predetermined, or predisposition is. So
I
yeah,
agree.
I just I wish we could break more of those walls down, not just in this area, but all over society. We have so much information at our fingertips. Willingness to you know be allowed to to do things and think and take action based upon objective data it's really important nowadays.
Yeah, agreed. Um, I think that just about summarizes the information that we have here. Again, we're going to make the findings, basically what's present in an Excel document. We're going to put it on our website. We'll do a YouTube version of this. We will do a Spotify version of this, which you're probably listening to one of the two right now.
Hello.
Yeah, hey. Um, but yeah, Ryan, I don't think I have a whole heck of a lot else to cover. We'll really look to the comments section of those sources, or Twitter, or whatever social channel you find us on, to
Yeah,
engage in
no, if
further
anybody
conversation.
has like additional information, like if you take the time to listen to this and the time to review the information we presented on the website, and you're like, hey, I know about this other place to like get good information regarding this kind of stuff, please let us know. We're all about the open discussion and the sharing of information. So like anything that you can contribute and help bring this conversation, more into a better place of understanding. It's it's really appreciated.
Hell yeah, man. Well said. Um, well, gang, thanks for hearing us out in this subject, and we hope to um, come to you with more high-profile subjects like these, as well as our standard weekly installments of what's happening in the league. So, thank you for listening, and won't be too long before you hear from us again.